What if God's greatest enemy never existed? The official story says that Lucifer fell from heaven out of pride, dragging rebellious angels with him. But what if that story was just a convenient version of events? Some long-forgotten manuscripts hint at another reality, one where Lucifer never opposed God, but instead fulfilled a role that was written from the very beginning. What if the light didn't fall by accident, but by divine decree? What if the so-called fall was nothing more than a staged play, carefully designed to build the illusion of an eternal war between good and evil? In this version, rebellion was never real, just a disguise to make humanity believe in a cosmic conflict between light and darkness. Because why would an all-knowing God allow a rebellion in heaven? Unless he had already planned it? What if he not only foresaw it, but ordered it? Some apocryphal texts speak of angels sent to confuse mankind. Angels who weren't disobedient at all, but rather following secret orders. Could these so-called fallen angels have been the true executors of the original divine plan? If so, every major event we know, the Great Flood, the destruction of Sodom, the Tower of Babel, might not have been acts of salvation, but rather carefully orchestrated scenes to control humanity's fate. And in this grand performance, Lucifer wouldn't be the villain, but the most loyal actor in all of creation. Why does the Bible fall silent whenever the scandal is too great to reveal? Why is God's number one enemy still described as the bearer of light? Perhaps the title adversary was nothing but a mask. What if everything has been flipped upside down to keep humanity blind? If this theory is true, then the line between heaven and hell was never real. What we've been told is salvation may actually be a prison, and what we call damnation could be true freedom. But why keep this secret hidden for millennia? Who would benefit from protecting this illusion? The answer may lie at the very foundations of the church itself, in a carefully crafted narrative, designed to maintain power via an obedience. Because if faith depends on the existence of an enemy, what happens when we discover that enemy was never real? And here comes the forbidden question. If Lucifer was always in alliance with God, then who is the true traitor of humankind? Perhaps the greatest deception in history isn't believing that Lucifer is the enemy, but failing to see that the real adversary has been sitting on heaven's throne all along. What do you think about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. What if the Tower of Babel wasn't an act of rebellion, but a project authorized by God himself? Since childhood, we've been taught that the Tower of Babel was a symbol of human pride, a moment when mankind tried to reach heaven and was punished with the confusion of languages. But ancient records hint at something the official narrative never dared to admit. There was no disobedience. There was order. Why was humanity, right after the Great Flood, suddenly united under one language, one nation, one purpose? Doesn't it seem likely that, after such massive destruction, the Creator himself would want to keep humanity centralized under a single power? What if Babel wasn't an offense, but an experiment? A laboratory of obedience, where God and Lucifer worked side by side, testing just how far humanity could be pushed. If the ultimate goal was always control, then why scatter the people? Maybe the confusion of languages wasn't a punishment at all, but the next step in a much bigger game. Divide to rule, weaken to dominate. What's more effective, a united humanity strong enough to reach the heavens, or a fragmented world divided by nations, religions, and endless wars? If this division was imposed, who truly benefited from it? And here, the shadow of Lucifer emerges, not as the rebel who sabotaged the divine plan, but as the engineer of the entire experiment, the bearer of light who guided mankind to raise their tower, only to later watch it be torn down by a higher command. What if the true lesson of Babel isn't about human pride, but about absolute obedience? No matter what humanity does, they are always playing within a narrative written by forces far above them. Why do certain apocryphal texts describe angels descending at Babel not to punish, but to instruct? Why do ancient traditions speak of secret knowledge being delivered to mankind at the very time the tower was rising? If Lucifer never truly rebelled, then Babel wasn't an accident, nor was it a threat. It was the symbolic mark of a hidden pact, to unite, then scatter, to build, then control. Proof that the theater of history never moves without the invisible hand guiding both sides. Perhaps the greatest mystery of Babel isn't the tower that fell, but the fact that from that moment on, humanity was never again free to speak the same language. If this struck a chord with you, like this video, what if the Great Flood wasn't a punishment, but a carefully planned reset for humanity? The Bible tells us that God decided to destroy the earth because wickedness had multiplied. But if God is all-knowing, wouldn't he have foreseen this corruption from the very beginning? So why create a world already destined for destruction? Here comes the forbidden question. What if the flood wasn't a moral response, but part of a divine project? The waters didn't come to fix a human mistake. They came to seal a divine agreement. The Book of Enoch describes how angels, the so-called watchers, taught humanity forbidden knowledge, astrology, metalworking, the arts of war. These weren't acts of rebellion, but of revelation. And what followed? A mass extermination. The bearers of light delivered wisdom, and soon after, the waters swept nearly everything away. If Lucifer was truly in alliance with God, then the flood wasn't just punishment. It was the sacrifice needed to cover up a secret. Humanity was never meant to have access to certain knowledge. The evil of mankind may not have been sin, but knowing too much. Why was Noah chosen? Was he truly a righteous man, or simply obedient? Enough to preserve a controlled bloodline? What if the ark wasn't a vessel of salvation, but a floating prison, ensuring that only those shaped by the divine plan would survive? Which is more terrifying, a divine punishment for human mistakes, or a strategic reset decided long before mankind ever existed? Curiously, ancient cultures across the world, Sumerian, Greek, Hindu, and many others, all tell of a great flood. Why does the same story appear in civilizations separated by oceans and centuries? And why do they all describe divine beings who erase humanity to start over? If human evil were truly random, each version would be completely different. But if the flood was planned, its repetition across cultures isn't coincidence. It's evidence. What if the waters weren't just destruction, but a symbolic cleansing, sealing a dark pact between God and Lucifer? A pact where humanity was never the main player, only a disposable piece on a divine chessboard. The real mystery of the flood isn't the ark that saved, but the silence of the waters that buried the first version of the truth. Subscribe, what comes next is even darker. What if Sodom and Gomorrah weren't corrupt cities, but guardians of a secret that had to be erased? The official story tells us that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of sin. But what if sin wasn't the real reason at all? Apocryphal texts and rabbinic traditions suggest another possibility. These cities may have been protecting knowledge that threatened the divine order. Why were angels sent personally to inspect Sodom? If God already knows all things, why would he need to see with his own eyes? Perhaps because this wasn't an act of judgment, but a containment mission. What if Sodom and Gomorrah were actually centers of worship? Places where men and women preserved ancient wisdom, passed down from the watchers? The fire that rained down from heaven may have been less of a punishment and more of a censorship. A divine fire meant to erase not only lives, but records, rituals, and traditions. Interestingly, the book of Ezekiel doesn't describe Sodom's sin as lust, but as arrogance, greed, and lack of compassion. Does that really sound worthy of total annihilation? Or was it simply a moral cover story to hide something much deeper? And why was Lot spared, an ordinary man with no great significance, except that he was willing to obey heavenly commands without question? Maybe Sodom and Gomorrah weren't destroyed because of their corruption, but because of their freedom. The fire that fell from the sky wasn't random. It was guided, as if an invisible hand traced the heavens, drawing a warning for all to see. And what if that same hand was the one that moved the waters of the flood? The pattern repeats itself. Forbidden knowledge is given, and soon after wiped out, first by water, now by fire, always under the same Narrative: humanity must never go beyond the limits set for them. But if Lucifer was truly in alliance with God, then he didn't try to corrupt Sodom. He may have simply carried out the mission of drawing human attention toward what was meant to remain hidden. And when the danger became too great, the order came down: erase everything. The true sin of Sodom may not have been lust, but the boldness of preserving something that was never meant to survive the flames. Share this with someone who needs to see what was hidden. What if the Exodus wasn't liberation, but the greatest act of blind obedience in history? The official version teaches us that the people of Israel were freed from slavery in Egypt by the mighty hand of God. But hidden within the details of the story, a disturbing pattern repeats itself. This so-called liberation always comes at the cost of blood. Why did the final plague require the death of every firstborn? Why did a mark of blood on the doors decide who would live and who would die? If God is just, why did the innocence of children have to be sacrificed? What if the Exodus wasn't a desperate escape, but a blood covenant sealed before the eyes of all Egypt? A massive collective ritual where Lucifer wasn't the enemy, but a hidden part of the machinery. A scenario where human suffering wasn't an accident, it was the requirement. The 10 plagues don't feel like acts of freedom. They sound more like calculated displays of power. Water turned to blood, total darkness, death spreading silently through the night. Each sign didn't just liberate, it conditioned. It taught that obedience mattered more than compassion. And what if the crossing of the sea wasn't a miracle, but divine theater? A grand spectacle meant to reinforce the narrative of a God demanding absolute submission. And in this performance, where was Lucifer? Perhaps hidden in the shadows, part of a greater plan where both villain and hero played rehearsed roles. In the desert, the pattern continued. Manna fell from heaven, but only enough for the next day. The people were given freedom, but under strict, suffocating rules. A covenant forged not through love, but through blood spilled on altars. If the Exodus was true liberation, why did every step forward demand another sacrifice? If it was salvation, why was the promise constantly delayed, conditioned and controlled? Maybe the real desert wasn't the endless sand and heat, but the desert of the human mind, trapped in a cycle of faith and fear. And what if this cycle was written from the very beginning, not as Lucifer's rebellion, but as his cooperation with God? A system of dual control, where heaven and hell are merely two faces of the same power. The true mystery of the Exodus isn't the parting of the sea, it's the unsettling truth that freedom has always been paid for with far too much blood. Have you ever wondered about this? Share your thoughts in the comments. What if the 10 Commandments weren't a gift, but a contract of eternal obedience? At the top of Mount Sinai, Moses received the tablets of the law. The official story describes this moment as the peak of the covenant between God and his people. But when we look closely, we don't just see commandments. We see a system of control. Why would the same God who freed his people immediately impose dozens of rules that governed every aspect of their lives? Why was their proclaimed freedom replaced by rigid codes, harsh punishments, and endless sacrifices? Sinai doesn't look like liberation. It looks like prison. What if the 10 Commandments weren't universal principles of justice, but seals of submission? Commandments that bound not only behavior, but also conscience. Rules that built an invisible wall where any deviation was labeled sin. If Lucifer never actually rebelled, then his role wouldn't be to tempt people into breaking the law, but to reinforce the belief that outside of the law there is no life. A hidden ally, sustaining the narrative of fear. Why did every law demand blood sacrifices? Why did a lamb, a goat, or another innocent animal have to die every single time someone failed? Wouldn't it have been simpler to teach forgiveness? The unsettling answer: the blood wasn't punishment. It was the fuel that kept the covenant alive. What if the tablets of Sinai weren't meant to protect humanity, but to seal an eternal contract, where every act of faith would require payment in blood? Some apocryphal texts suggest Moses didn't just descend with laws, but with secrets, instructions for rituals, sacrifices, and symbols never revealed in the official texts. What else was given on that mountain? Why were the people never allowed to read what Moses truly saw? Maybe Sinai wasn't the place of revelation, but of concealment. The fire, smoke, and thunder weren't just to impress the crowd. They were there to hide the true author of the contract. The greatest mystery of Sinai isn't the tablets Moses shattered, but the question that still echoes today: who really wrote the law? Like this, if any part of this made you feel uneasy. What if the voice of God heard by the prophets wasn't one, but many, and even contradictory? Prophets are portrayed as faithful messengers of divine will. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, each proclaiming oracles that shaped centuries of faith. But when we place their words side by side, something unsettling emerges. The voices don't fully agree. Why would the same God, at one moment, call for mercy, and at another demand total destruction? Why does he promise peace, then command bloody wars? If truth is singular, why is the message fragmented? What if the prophets weren't speaking to one God, but to different voices sharing the same throne? Voices that contradict each other, because they represent opposing sides of the same covenant. God and Lucifer, not as eternal enemies, but as alternating faces, shifting speeches, confusing humanity to keep it obedient. The apocryphal texts deepen this mystery. The book of Baruch, for instance, describes visions where the prophet sees thrones upon thrones, and beings who speak in the name of the Most High, yet give conflicting commands. Who was really speaking, and why did the church choose only certain voices for the canon, silencing so many others? If Lucifer never truly rebelled, perhaps his role was exactly this: to embody the voice of opposition, the word that divides, the message that wounds, yet still part of the same divine script. Thus the people believed they were witnessing two sides at war, when, in truth, they were hearing a single celestial court playing different roles. The prophets condemned idolatry, yet spoke of a God who demanded altars, sacrifices, and blood. They denounced false gods, while describing a deity who acted exactly like the ones they condemned. What then was the difference? Or was it all just another mask? Which is more disturbing, to think the prophets lied, or to accept that they spoke the truth? But a fractured truth, revealing the duality of the one who reigns. The real mystery of the prophets isn't in what they said, but in the silence about who was truly speaking behind the voice. Subscribe, the truth doesn't end here. What if Christ's coming wasn't just about salvation, but the ultimate breaking of an ancient pact between God and Lucifer? For centuries, prophetic voices shaped faith, shifting between promises of peace and decrees of destruction. But then a new figure emerged: Christ. He didn't just contradict the prophets, he dismantled the entire sacrificial system that religion was built upon. While the old voices demanded the blood of lambs, Christ declared, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." While Moses established laws of the sword and vengeance, Christ preached, "Love your enemies." This wasn't just a new teaching, it was a radical severing of the old covenant itself. What if Christ wasn't simply the Son sent by God, but the turning point that exposed the duplicity of these so-called divine voices? Because up until then, God and Lucifer seemed to speak in turns, but Christ came to unmask the stage and declare that the performance was over. The apocryphal Gospels reinforce this rupture. In the Gospel of Thomas, Christ says, "If those who lead you say, 'The kingdom is in the sky,' then the birds will get there before you. If they say, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will reach it first. But the kingdom is within you, and it is around you. No more altars, no more temples, no more sacrifices, no more faith built on fear." And that is why he was rejected. Christ wasn't crucified just by Rome. He was condemned by the very religious system that thrived on this ancient pact. He wasn't challenging Caesar's throne. He was challenging the throne that kept God and Lucifer as two faces of the same rule. The crucifixion wasn't merely punishment. It was an attempt to restore the broken pact. Killing Christ was an effort to silence his declaration that the game was over. But the most disturbing question remains: if Christ broke the pact, why did organized religion continue feeding the same system of fear? Sacrifice and guilt? Could it be that the church never truly accepted the rupture and instead rewrote Christ to fit him back into the eternal game between God and Lucifer? The greatest secret isn't the cross itself, but who truly benefited from it. If this revelation made you see things differently, don't stop here. Subscribe, become a member, and join us behind the scenes of this forbidden investigation. What if the church didn't truly follow Christ, but instead rebuilt the very pact he came to destroy? After the crucifixion, what should have been a final rupture slowly became continuity. Christ preached the end of sacrifice, but soon the church reintroduced blood, not from animals, but symbolized in the Eucharist. He announced the freedom of the inner kingdom, yet the church built temples, hierarchies, and altars that demanded obedience. The message that was meant to set people free was reinterpreted to maintain control. What began as a break became a careful reconstruction. And so the ancient pact between God and Lucifer, exposed by Christ, was rewoven by the very institution claiming to represent him. Church councils decided which gospels would be canonized and which would be burned into oblivion. The Christ of love and liberation was tamed, replaced by the Christ of law, authority, and fear. A Christ who no longer shattered pacts, but legitimized them. In this game, the church became the true throne of the pact, no longer in the heavens or the desert, but in Vatican halls, on altars, and within sacraments, a covenant held together by the promise of salvation and the eternal threat of hell. Ask yourself, if Christ truly defeated the pact, why was his original message erased, censored, and forbidden? And what if the very concept of hell, so absent from much of Christ's actual words, was amplified by the church precisely to keep alive the structure he came to destroy? The irony is devastating. The Son came to set humanity free, yet was turned into a symbol of captivity. The blood shed to end sacrifice became the justification for an eternal ritual. And so the game between God and Lucifer gained a new board, no longer Eden, no longer the desert, but the church itself. The pact wasn't destroyed, it simply changed its face. The real secret isn't about who founded the church, but about who still rules through it today. If this hidden truth resonates with you, subscribe now and become part of this investigation. Only then can more people discover what they were never meant to know. What if everything we've been taught about heaven, hell, and salvation was nothing more than part of an ancient plan, still keeping us bound? From the very beginning, the human story has been guided by forces that manipulate both light and darkness. If Lucifer never truly rebelled, then what we call a cosmic war may have been nothing more than a carefully staged performance. The flood, the Tower of Babel, Sodom and Gomorrah, the Exodus, and even the cross of Christ. All signs of a pact that was never broken, only redesigned. Over the centuries, the church didn't just preserve this narrative, it cemented it, turning the original theater into law, doctrine, and ritual. What we were taught to see as salvation was, in many cases, a prison. What we call sin was often just a boundary designed to keep the game in motion. The apocryphal texts, hidden manuscripts, and suppressed traditions all point to the same truth: a secret agreement between the heavenly throne and the light that guides humanity. The duality was never really about heaven versus hell, but about how we were taught to perceive them. If Lucifer has always been God's ally, then the true enemy doesn't dwell in the shadows, but rules through the very light that convinces us to obey without question. Human freedom, knowledge, awareness, all carefully conditioned by an invisible contract. And every time we follow blindly, we strengthen a pact that began long before we were even born. Perhaps the final question is the hardest one of all. If the play never ended, if the voices still echo, if the story is still being rewritten, who truly holds the power? And are we meant to discover the truth, or simply play the roles we were assigned from the very beginning? If this is the truth, why are we still clapping with our eyes closed, applauding a performance that never ended? And if all of this is real, what's your truth? Share it below.